The rain had barely stopped when Gift found the letter, her name written in the frail hand of the man she once served. "You gave me back my soul," it read. But that wasn't how their story began. Months earlier, she had been nothing more than a maid, invisible in the house of a billionaire haunted by his past. What neither of them knew was that their meeting would uncover sins money couldn't bury, and mercy neither of them believed they still had. When the truth finally came, it didn't arrive with thunder, but with silence. Because sometimes, forgiveness is the loudest sound a broken heart can make. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The Whitmore estate stood like a forgotten cathedral at the edge of the city, its marble pillars reaching for a sky heavy with the scent of coming rain. Decades ago, it had been the crown of the Whitmore Empire, a home of lavish dinners, political guests, and symphonies echoing through the halls. Now, it was quiet. Too quiet. Even the chandeliers, thick with dust and memory, seemed to mourn the absence of laughter. Inside, the silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. The kind that pressed on the chest and whispered in the ears, reminding those within that time had stopped paying attention long ago. Gift moved through that silence as though she had been born from it. Barely 25, she carried the grace of someone who'd learned early that the world rarely noticed gentle souls. Her footsteps were soft against the marble, her movements deliberate and careful. She wore a black dress and a white apron that hung from her waist, both crisp and clean, though faded at the edges from too many washings. Each morning she began her routine, dusting, polishing, folding, restoring. Not just the furniture, but the illusion of life. She straightened the books Sam never read anymore, cleaned the crystal glasses no one drank from, and changed flowers that never seemed to wilt, as if the mansion itself feared her touch might reveal its age. Every sound in the house was amplified, the ticking of clocks, the faint hum of the air vents, the whisper of her broom against the floor. Even the old man's breathing upstairs felt like a haunting rhythm. Samuel Whitmore, Mr. Sam, as Gift respectfully called him, was a name once spoken in awe across the city. At 88, he had lived long enough to see his own legend fade into myth. Billionaire. Investor. Philanthropist. Those were the words the newspapers still used when they occasionally wrote about him, though the world had long since moved on to new faces, new empires. To Gift, however, he was just the quiet man at the end of the corridor, a shadow behind glass doors, surrounded by trophies and portraits that stared like silent witnesses. Sometimes she caught him watching her from the study doorway. He would stand there in his tailored suit, his silver hair brushed back, his cane held lightly in one hand. His eyes, pale and sharp, followed her like he was trying to remember something. Not her, but what it felt like to notice someone again. Gift never spoke unless spoken to. That was the rule she'd learned in every house she'd ever worked in. Still, she sensed something in him, not cruelty, not arrogance, but emptiness. He had the look of a man haunted not by ghosts, but by memories too heavy to bury. The mansion itself felt like him, alive but hollow. Every corner told a story. The grand piano in the parlor, its keys untouched since his wife's passing. The dining room with its 12 chairs, though only one was ever used. The gallery lined with oil portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her as she cleaned. There were rooms she had never been asked to enter. The master bedroom, sealed since the late Mrs. Whitmore's death 15 years ago. The east wing, filled with boxes, canvases, and forgotten relics. Gift respected those boundaries. She understood that some silences were not meant to be broken. Yet, she couldn't ignore the ache that filled the air, the loneliness so thick she could almost hear it breathing beside her. Sometimes, when she worked late, she would hum softly to herself, old church songs her mother used to sing. The sound drifted through the corridors like a fragile bird, perching for a moment before fading into the stillness. She thought no one heard. But upstairs, Sam would pause his reading. He would listen. It wasn't the words that caught him, he barely remembered the tune. It was the humanity of it. The sound of something living. The next morning, he had asked the butler, "Who hums at night?" The man had answered simply, "The maid, sir." "Gift." "Gift," Sam repeated, as if the name itself was foreign. Fitting. From then on, he began noticing small things. The way she carefully arranged his late wife's flowers on the table, how she folded napkins with precision, how she never left the room until everything was perfect. She reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years: presence. One afternoon, as Gift was dusting the library shelves, she saw him sitting by the window, a book open but unread. The sunlight framed him like a portrait: proud posture, tired eyes, the quiet fragility of old age. She hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt, but he spoke first without turning. "Do you ever get tired of the silence, Gift?" She froze, unsure how to answer. "Sometimes, sir," she said softly. "But silence can be kind too." He turned then, studying her face, the honesty in her eyes, the simplicity in her answer. "Kind," he murmured. "I don't think I've ever thought of silence that way." She smiled faintly and continued dusting, her heart beating a little faster. That was their first real conversation. After that, the air between them shifted. He didn't speak often, but he began greeting her in the mornings, a small nod replacing years of indifference. Sometimes he would watch as she worked, his gaze distant yet present, as if seeing her kept him anchored to the world. Gift noticed something too. His trophies were polished, his suits pressed, but his eyes were tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He ate little, spoke less, and spent hours staring at the portraits of people long gone. She wondered if he remembered what warmth felt like. One day, as she cleaned the grand staircase, she looked up at him standing on the landing. "Sir," she asked gently, "do you ever miss them?" He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He looked down at her with a ghost of a smile. "Every day," he said. "But memories don't fade. They just grow quieter." Gift nodded, understanding more than her years should allow. "Maybe they wait," she whispered, "for someone brave enough to listen again." That night, long after she'd gone, Sam sat alone in his study. The ticking clock filled the room like a heartbeat. He looked around, at the gold-framed photos, the trophies, the empty glass. Beside him, and for the first time in decades, he realized how loud silence could be. And somewhere deep inside the mansion, her faint humming rose again, soft, steady, human. The sound made him close his eyes. He smiled, not as a man who had everything, but as one who had finally begun to feel again. The mansion, it seemed, had just taken its first breath in years. Rain hammered the glass like impatient fists, each drop echoing through the hollow corridors of the Whitmore mansion. Thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the chandeliers and muting the rhythm of the ticking clocks. It was the kind of storm that made the world outside disappear, and forced the world within to listen to itself. Gift was finishing her rounds when the first lightning strike cut through the windows like a blade of light. The power flickered, then steadied. She tightened her apron and hurried down the hall, her shadow stretching long against the marble. The house felt uneasy, as if the storm had stirred not just clouds, but memories. She paused by the study door. Light spilled from underneath, trembling with the flicker of a dying fire. Inside, Sam Whitmore sat at his massive oak desk, papers scattered, a half-empty glass trembling in his wrinkled hand. He was mumbling softly, fragments of names, apologies, moments only ghosts could hear. Then the thunder roared again, and Gift heard the crash. Her heart leapt. She pushed open the heavy door and froze. Sam lay crumpled on the floor beside his desk, his cane knocked aside, his breath shallow and uneven. For one suspended second, the only sound was the rain outside, relentless and merciless. "Mr. Sam," she gasped, dropping to her knees. Her hands trembled as she turned him gently. His face was pale, the firelight catching the deep lines around his eyes. Panic rushed through her, but she fought it. Years of caring for the frail and forgotten had taught her calm in the face of fear. She checked his pulse. Faint, but there. "Hold on, sir, please," she whispered. She loosened his collar, dragged the rug from beneath the desk, and propped him gently against the armchair. The old man stirred but didn't wake. Gift ran for the kitchen, grabbed a damp towel, and returned, pressing it against his forehead. Lightning flashed again, filling the room with cold, white truth. Two souls who didn't belong to the same world, yet somehow did. Minutes became hours. She stayed beside him, refilling the fire, listening to his ragged breathing. At one point, his hand twitched, frail fingers brushing hers, as if reaching for something lost long ago. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the sky washed pale and quiet. The mansion smelled of smoke and rain. Gift sat slumped in the chair beside him, her eyes heavy but alert. Sam stirred first. His eyes opened slowly, confused at the sight before him. the young maid asleep beside his armchair, her head resting on her folded arms. For a moment, he didn't move. He studied her, the faint worry lines around her brow, the exhaustion in her stillness. He shifted slightly, and she woke with a start. "Sir, you're awake." His lips parted, voice hoarse. "You stayed." Gift nodded quickly, embarrassed. "I couldn't leave you like that, sir. You fainted. I didn't want you to be alone." He blinked, still disoriented. "Alone," he repeated the word softly, as though tasting it. Then, something unexpected, a faint smile. "That's rare." She helped him sit upright, supporting his shoulder as if he were made of glass. He tried to speak again, but the words faltered. Finally, he said, "Tea. I'd like tea." Moments later, she brought a tray, porcelain teacups, honey, and warm biscuits. The scent filled the room like a quiet blessing. Sam watched her pour, her movements steady and graceful, the storm reflected faintly in her dark eyes. He had been served tea by hundreds of people in his lifetime, assistants, hosts, servants, but never had it been done with such genuine care. He cleared his throat, the weight of formality softening. "Your name," he said finally. "I know it, but I've never said it." Gift hesitated, unsure if she should respond. "Gift, sir." He nodded, tasting the syllables slowly. "Gift." Then again softer, like a prayer. "A beautiful name. You've been here how long?" 3 years, sir." 3 years, he echoed, looking away. "And I never noticed." There was no bitterness in her eyes, only humility. "You've had much to think about, sir." His gaze returned to her, sharper now, studying her. "That's the problem," he murmured. "I've spent 88 years thinking about everything, and no one." Gift looked down. The silence between them wasn't awkward this time, it was full, alive. He took a slow sip of tea and exhaled deeply, his hand still trembling slightly. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said quietly, though his tone carried no rebuke. "It's not your duty to care beyond the hours you're paid for." Gift met his eyes. "Sometimes duty isn't what keeps us," she said. "Sometimes it's conscience." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, then something gentler. "You talk like a woman twice your age." "Life teaches fast, sir," she replied, smiling faintly. He chuckled weakly. "And here I thought wisdom came with wrinkles." Outside, sunlight began to pour through the window, touching the silver in his hair and the brown in her skin with the same soft light. The storm had cleansed the world, and perhaps, something within the house too. Sam set down his cup. "You saved me, Gift." She shook her head quickly. "No, sir. Just did what anyone would have done." "No," he said again, more firmly this time. "Not anyone." For a moment, the air felt still, as if the mansion itself was listening. In that simple exchange, something unseen shifted between them. The line that had separated master and servant for years blurred just enough for humanity to breathe through. He looked at her not as a maid, but as a person, one who had faced storms far greater than the one outside. When she rose to leave, he stopped her with a soft voice. "Gift." She turned. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded, smiling gently, and stepped into the quiet hall. The air smelled of rain and renewal. For the first time since she'd entered that mansion, she felt seen, not as help, not as background, but as someone whose kindness mattered. Upstairs, Sam remained seated long after she'd gone, staring into the fading glow of the fire. His fingers rested on the edge of his teacup. It was strange, he thought. After 88 years of wealth, business, and power, the one person who had reminded him of his humanity was the one who had nothing to gain from it. And outside, in the soft dawn light, the storm retreated beyond the hills, but it had already done its work. It had broken the silence. The evenings inside Whitmore Mansion had grown softer since the storm, not in light, but in spirit. Where silence once reigned like a king, now faint echoes of conversation drifted through the halls. Each night, after dinner, Sam would sit in his study, the fire warming his fragile hands, while Gift tidied nearby, pretending not to listen. But he always began speaking, to her, to the room, perhaps to himself. But Charles only smirked, circling the room. "It's funny, Uncle. I read that lonely men often grow fond of their caretakers. She's quite lovely, isn't she? Though I must say, you always had unconventional taste. The insult burned through the air like acid. Gift's fingers trembled, but she said nothing. Sam rose from his chair, leaning on his cane. "You forget yourself, boy." Charles laughed coldly. "Do I? I'm only saying what everyone else would. You, an 88-year-old recluse, and her? Don't tell me you actually believe she cares about you for anything more than what you can give her." The words hit harder than thunder. The silence that followed was deafening. Gift's eyes flickered toward Sam, waiting, hoping for his voice, his defense, his truth. But he said nothing. His face was a mask of conflict, pride battling shame, hesitation silencing the compassion that had once bridged their worlds. Charles smirked, sensing victory. "I'll have the lawyers contact you about the estate. You're not yourself anymore, old man. It's time someone looked after the family's interests, before people like her get too comfortable." He left as abruptly as he'd come, the door slamming like a final insult. Gift stood frozen in the doorway, the tray still in her hands, her throat tight with unshed tears. Sam turned toward her, but the words didn't come. The air between them was no longer warm, it had cooled into something fragile and painful. She lowered her eyes. "I'll bring your tea later, sir." Then she walked away, her footsteps soft but heavy with disappointment. That night, the rain came. It always seemed to rain when the heart was breaking. The gardens shimmered under the downpour, the scent of wet earth rising in waves. Gift sat alone beneath the old oak tree, the same one she often passed on her way to work, her apron soaked, her face streaked with rain and tears alike. She didn't sob, not loudly, at least. The pain had gone too deep for sound. She whispered to the storm instead, her words lost to the wind. "Why is it that kindness always costs so much?" From the mansion, a shadow moved across the veranda. Sam watched her from the doorway, guilt churning in his chest like thunder waiting to break. He had seen wars of power, the rise and fall of companies, but never had he felt so small. He grabbed his cane and stepped into the rain. The cold bit at his bones, but he kept walking, each step a silent apology. When he reached her, she didn't turn. The rain ran down his face like tears he'd forgotten how to shed. "Gift," he said softly. She flinched, but didn't look up. "You shouldn't be out here, sir. You'll catch a chill." "I deserve worse," he murmured. She said nothing. The silence pressed between them, broken only by the whisper of rain on leaves. "I was a coward today," Sam finally said, his voice rough and low. "You reminded me what kindness looks like, and I let fear silence me." Gift's eyes closed, the words cutting deeper than any insult. "You don't owe me an apology, sir." "Yes, I do," he said firmly, his old voice trembling. "Because I know what it's like to be judged by people who never took the time to understand. I spent a lifetime letting pride dictate mercy. And today, I saw myself in him." She looked at him then, truly looked, the frail man standing drenched in the rain, his silver hair plastered to his forehead, his hand clutching his cane like a sinner clinging to confession. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you let him speak to me that way?" His shoulders sagged. "Because old habits die harder than guilt. I've spent too many years protecting a name, not a soul. I wanted to shout to defend you, but all I could hear was the ghost of who I used to be." Gift's tears mingled with the rain. "I never wanted anything from you, sir. Just respect." He nodded slowly. "And you deserve nothing less." The air grew still again, softer now. He reached out a trembling hand, hesitant, then rested it gently on her shoulder. The gesture said what his words could not. She met his gaze, weary, kind, and forgiving all at once, and managed a faint smile. "You're not the man he thinks you are." "And you," he replied softly, "are more than the world will ever deserve." They stood like that for a long moment, two silhouettes in the rain, neither master nor servant anymore, just two human beings bound by the fragile thread of remorse and grace. As the thunder faded, Sam finally spoke. "Will you forgive me, Gift?" She sighed, her breath trembling. "I already have, sir. But don't let fear speak louder than truth again." He nodded. "Never again." The rain eased into a gentle drizzle, washing away the anger, the shame, and perhaps a little of the past itself. From that night on, the mansion no longer felt as lonely. The silence had changed once more, this time into understanding. If you were in Gift's place, humiliated for simply caring, standing in the storm of someone else's fear. Would you forgive, or would you walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Morning sunlight crept into the mansion like forgiveness itself, slow, quiet, and golden. The storm from the night before had left the air smelling of wet soil and renewal. Gift walked through the hallways with her usual calm, but something felt different. The house was too still. No clinking of teacups, no faint hum from the study. Just silence, soft, but not the cold kind. Then she saw it, a single envelope resting on the silver tray outside Sam's study door. Her name was written in shaky cursive, the ink slightly smudged. Gift. Nothing else. Her heart tightened. She lifted it gently, running her fingers over the fragile paper before sitting down by the window to read. Inside, the letter trembled with age and truth. Gift. I have spent 88 years chasing everything that never mattered and ignoring everything that did. Wealth, legacy, recognition. All of it feels empty now that I've seen what genuine kindness looks like. You have reminded me of something I buried long ago, the courage to care. You spoke of pain with honesty, and I saw my own arrogance reflected in your silence. You didn't need to heal me, but you did. The truth is, I have carried guilt like a crown, for mistaking power for worth, for measuring people by their use, for letting others suffer unseen. I was not blind, Gift. I simply refused to see. If tomorrow never comes for me, I want you to know, you are my redemption. Sam. The words blurred as her eyes filled with tears. She pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of his confession, not as guilt, but as grace. Moments later, she hurried to his room. The door was slightly ajar, the morning light spilling across the floor like a blessing. Sam lay propped against his pillows, pale but peaceful. He turned his head as she entered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You found it, he murmured, his voice a whisper of air. Yes, sir, she said softly, sitting beside his bed. You shouldn't have written so much. You need rest. He chuckled weakly. Rest has been chasing me for years. I thought it was time I stopped running. Gift smiled through her tears. You don't need to say sorry anymore. He reached for her hand, frail, trembling, but steady in its intent. I do. Not for what I've done, but for what I failed to do, to see the people who made my world possible. I thought being powerful meant never needing anyone. You showed me that needing someone isn't weakness, it's human. Their hands remained joined, the warmth between them fragile but real. Gift looked at him, really looked. The proud lines of his face had softened, the hard set of his jaw replaced by quiet surrender. You've changed, she said. He smiled faintly. Maybe you reminded me who I was before I forgot. The clock ticked softly, marking moments that neither of them tried to rush. Outside, the garden shimmered with dew, each droplet catching the sunlight like scattered diamonds. I'm not afraid anymore, Sam said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the window. I thought death was the end of everything, but now I think it's just the moment when we stop pretending we were ever in control. Gift squeezed his hand gently. You've lived a big life, sir. He looked at her, his gaze full of both apology and gratitude. And yet this moment, feels bigger than all of it. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. Then maybe that means you finally lived right. He closed his eyes briefly, his breathing slow but steady. Do you know what the strangest thing is? What, sir? I can't remember the sound of applause from all those business awards, but I'll never forget your humming that night after the storm. Gift laughed softly, covering her mouth as the tears fell faster. You heard that? I did, he said with a tired grin. It sounded like forgiveness. For a while, neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The air around them felt different now, no longer the heavy silence of guilt, but the kind that comes when hearts finally stop fighting the truth. She stayed there until the sunlight dimmed, reading the letter again and again, tracing every word with reverence. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a confession, a legacy, and a blessing all at once. Later that night, as the lamps flickered low, she found herself standing in the study once more. On his desk, beneath the faint glow of the lamp, lay another piece of paper, blank. She sat down and began to write. Dear Mr. Sam, you once said the world failed me. Maybe it did. But it also sent me here, to remind you that no one is too broken to be forgiven. You gave me back something I thought I lost, the belief that kindness can still change a heart. Thank you for listening when no one else did. She folded the note and placed it beside his letter, two souls speaking across paper, one from guilt, the other from grace. When she looked up, the portrait of Sam's late wife seemed softer in the dim light, as if even the walls of the house had found peace. Outside, the first stars appeared, silent witnesses to a story that had begun in pain but ended in redemption. If someone who once judged you came seeking forgiveness, truly seeking it, could you give it? Could you let go of the hurt and choose peace instead? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The mansion had never been this quiet. Even the clocks seemed to tick slower, as though time itself refused to move forward. Morning light poured through the tall windows, soft and forgiving, brushing against the velvet curtains like a final blessing. Gift moved carefully through the corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly against the marble floor. The air carried a strange stillness, not the cold silence that had once haunted the house, but something gentler, almost sacred. She paused at Sam's door, noticing it was slightly open. Her heart tightened. Inside, he looked peaceful. Too peaceful. The blankets were neatly folded across his chest, his hands resting lightly on them. His face, once furrowed with guilt and burden, was now calm, a faint smile frozen on his lips, as if he had finally heard something beautiful in the quiet. Gift froze in the doorway, unable to move. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she waited, hoped, to see his chest rise again. But the truth came softly, like the morning itself. Sam Whitmore had passed away in his sleep. Her knees weakened. She crossed the room slowly, trembling hands reaching out to touch his shoulder. "Sir," she whispered. "Mr. Sam." Silence answered. Her gaze fell on the nightstand beside him, a small envelope cream-colored, with her name written across it in his frail handwriting. She picked it up, tears already blurring her vision. Gift. When I was young, I believed the measure of a man was in what he built. I see now that the measure of a soul lies in who it learns to love, even after failure. You gave me back my soul. Don't mourn me as a master. Remember me as a man who finally learned to listen. She pressed the letter to her heart and wept, not with despair, but with gratitude. The tears were heavy, but cleansing. Every act of kindness, every conversation they had shared, now came rushing back like fragments of light breaking through clouds. Later that afternoon, the mansion was filled with quiet footsteps and murmured condolences. Men in suits spoke in hushed tones about assets and legacies, about the empire Sam had built and the power he had wielded. None spoke of the man who had learned humility in his final days. The funeral was held in the garden, Sam's favorite place. The sky was bright, the air crisp with the scent of lilies. Dozens of guests attended, business partners, distant relatives, journalists, and strangers who knew his name but never his heart. They praised his fortune, his foresight, his empire. Gift stood at the back, her uniform black and pressed, a white scarf tied neatly at her throat. No one paid her much attention. To them, she was just another servant. But when the priest finished his final prayer and invited others to speak, she stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but only for a moment. "I cleaned Mr. Whitmore's floors," she began, "but I also watched him learn to walk through his own shadows." Heads turned. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Gift continued, her eyes fixed on the wooden coffin before her. He was a man who had everything, except peace. He thought power could fill the silence in his heart. It couldn't. What did, was learning to listen, to see people not as beneath him but beside him. The wind brushed through the trees as if pausing to listen. In his last days, he spoke not of money, but of mercy. Not of business, but of forgiveness. He said, "I gave him back his soul, but he gave me something too, proof that even the hardest hearts can learn to be kind again." Her voice cracked on the last word. She stepped forward, placing a single white flower on the coffin. Her hand lingered there as she whispered, "Rest, Sam. You finally listened." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. As the ceremony ended, the crowd dispersed, their conversations dissolving into the rustle of leaves. Gift stayed behind, alone. The garden shimmered beneath the sunlight, and she could almost feel the air lighten, as though the mansion's ghosts, and Sam's regrets, had finally been released. She looked back at the grand house on the hill. It no longer looked cold or haunted. The windows reflected the sky, blue, endless, and free. That evening, she returned inside. The halls were quiet, but the silence was no longer heavy. She walked to the study, where his old chair faced the fireplace, and placed the letter beside it. The fire crackled softly, the way it used to when he would sit and talk about life, loss, and the courage to change. Gift smiled faintly. "You did it," she whispered. "You found peace." Outside, the wind swept gently across the garden, rustling the white lilies she had planted weeks ago. They bowed slightly, as though the earth itself was saying goodbye. That night, as the moon climbed high over the mansion, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like a house of shadows, it felt like home. If someone who once judged or hurt you sought forgiveness with a humble heart, could you truly forgive them? Could you lay the past to rest, as Gift did, and let compassion speak louder than pride? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The seasons turned, and the Whitmore mansion, once a fortress of silence and regret, stood now as a monument to peace. Its tall windows still caught the sunrise, but inside, the air no longer carried the chill of loneliness. The laughter of strangers sometimes echoed in its halls, not in mockery, but in gratitude. For in death, Sam Whitmore had given life to something greater than himself. Months had passed since his funeral, but for Gift, the memory of that morning never truly faded. Each time she passed through the garden where she'd laid the white flower on his grave, she whispered a prayer, not of sorrow but of thanks. His words, written in trembling ink, had become her compass. Now she stood before a modest two-story house painted a soft shade of blue, sunlight glinting off its new sign, the Whitmore Home for Hope. It wasn't grand like the mansion she once cleaned, but it was alive, filled with warmth, chatter, and the scent of bread baking in the kitchen. Children ran across the courtyard, their laughter carried on the wind like songs of freedom. Gift walked among them, her apron replaced by a simple white blouse and long skirt. There was peace in her movements, not the quiet submission of a servant, but the calm assurance of a woman who had rebuilt her soul. She bent down to tie a child's shoelace, her hands gentle, her smile soft. Inside her small office, the walls were lined with framed drawings from the children, stick figures, painted hearts, handprints in every color. On her desk sat an old, folded letter, edges worn from being read too often. It was Sam's final note, the one she had found beside his bed. She opened it carefully, the paper yellowed but the words eternal. "Life is not about what we own, Gift, but who we heal before we go." She read it slowly, as she always did, and smiled. Then she placed it back inside her Bible, tucked between Psalms and the story of the prodigal son, a reminder that mercy, no matter how late, was still mercy. Her days were no longer filled with silence, but with purpose. She had turned the pain of servitude into the strength of service. The home cared for orphans, widows, and the forgotten, people like her younger self, who had once believed they were invisible. Every morning, she stood by the doorway greeting visitors, her heart swelling with quiet pride as new faces arrived seeking help, not judgment. The funds for the home had come from a trust Sam left behind, a scholarship in her name. The Gift Foundation, they called it now. The irony made her smile every time. One afternoon, as she served lunch to the children, a little girl with bright curls looked up at her and asked, "Miss Gift, is it true you used to live in a castle?" Gift laughed, the sound light and full. "It wasn't a castle, sweet one. Just a big, lonely house." "Was it scary?" Gift paused, glancing toward the window where sunlight poured through the glass, catching dust motes in a golden dance. "It was," she said softly, "until someone taught me that even the coldest walls can remember warmth." The girl tilted her head. "Who taught you that?" Gift smiled faintly. "A stubborn old man with too many trophies and not enough love." The child giggled and ran off, her laughter spilling into the courtyard. Gift's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the sun was beginning its descent. The golden light touched her face, gentle and familiar. It felt almost like his hand, resting on her shoulder, reminding her that even in endings, there is continuity. Later that evening, she sat alone on the front steps, the air cool but comforting. The hum of crickets filled the silence, and the orange glow of dusk painted everything in warmth. She thought of Sam, not as the man who had once lived above others, but as the one who finally bowed his head in understanding. She remembered his trembling voice, "You gave me back my soul." She had not known then how much those words would shape her life. But now, watching the children she cared for, the widows she sheltered, the lost she guided, she realized, mercy had multiplied. A boy approached her, holding a small notebook. "Miss Gift," he said shyly, "can I show you my drawing?" She took the paper. It was a picture of a house beneath a golden sun, with two figures standing hand in hand, one old, one young. Above them were 3 words written in uneven letters: "Love never dies." Her throat tightened. "It's beautiful," she whispered. The boy grinned. "I drew you and Mr. Whitmore." Tears filled her eyes, but her smile never wavered. "He'd like that," she said softly. "He really would." As the boy ran off, the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. The day had ended, but not her story, not his either. She looked up at the heavens, her voice barely above a breath. "Rest easy, Sam. Your light's still here." And as the twilight deepened, it almost seemed as though the mansion on the distant hill glowed once more, not from gold or grandeur, but from peace. The same peace that now lived in her heart. Gift closed her eyes and smiled, the world quiet around her. The maid who once cleaned another man's world now built her own, not with marble, but with mercy. Not with wealth, but with love. And as the first stars appeared, the wind carried one last whisper through the night. Life is not about what we own, but who we heal. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that compassion can change even the hardest hearts, share it with someone who still believes redemption is impossible. Because sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to rewrite a lifetime of pain. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember their worth, and subscribe to join us for more stories that touch the soul and remind the world what real humanity looks like.